The auctioneer's hammer froze mid-swing as his voice cracked on the words that would haunt Red Mesa forever. Lot 17, one blind Indian woman and her half-breed daughter. Ayanna Crow Feather stood motionless on the wooden platform, her weathered hands gripping 13-year-old Winona's trembling shoulders, both dressed in their only remaining clothes, faded calico that had seen better seasons. This wasn't a livestock auction. This was human trafficking disguised as legal remedy. A woman in the crowd gasped and turned away, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Children pointed until their mothers yanked their arms down. The August heat seemed to thicken with shame as grown men calculated what use they might have for a blind woman and her child. Ayanna's clouded eyes stared straight ahead, but her daughter could see everything. The hunger in certain faces, the horror in others, the cruel indifference that had brought them to this moment. Just 6 months ago they'd had a home, dignity, hope. "Do I hear $20? Judge Stone's voice cut through the suffocating silence, then hoofbeats. Dust. A gravelly voice from nowhere. $50, and I'll take them both. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The mysterious voice belonged to a man who emerged from the dust cloud like something out of a dime novel. Thomas Hawk Whitehorse sat atop a paint horse, his weathered face shadowed beneath a black hat that had seen too many storms. At 38, he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every movement mattered, every word carried weight. His clothes told a story of contradictions: quality boots worn thin, a silver belt buckle that caught the light, and a coat that had once been expensive but now bore the honest stains of hard travel. 6 months earlier, Ayanna Crow Feather had been the most respected teacher in 3 counties, her small schoolhouse filled with children of all backgrounds who hung on her every word. She had taught them to read not just English but to see the beauty in both worlds, the traditional stories of her people and the promises of American education. Her husband, Robert, had worked the silver mines until a cave-in claimed his life and left her with debts that grew like tumbleweeds in a drought. The mine explosion that took Robert had also stolen her sight in one eye and severely damaged the other, though she guarded this secret like her life depended on it, because it did. Young Winona possessed her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn courage. At 13, she had already learned to navigate between worlds, translating not just languages but entire ways of being. Her mixed heritage made her an outsider in both communities, but her fierce loyalty to her mother had transformed her into something stronger than either, a bridge between what was and what could be. She watched the stranger with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, noting the way he sat his horse, the expensive leather of his saddle, the careful way he counted out coins that represented far more than $50 to a drifting cowboy. Red Mesa existed in that strange space between civilization and frontier, where territorial law bent to the will of whoever held the most influence. Judge Jeremiah Stone had crafted the Dependent Persons Act with surgical precision, creating a legal framework that allowed the town to auction off anyone deemed unable to care for themselves. Widows, orphans, the elderly, the disabled, all could be legally transferred to new guardians who would bear responsibility for their debts and welfare. On paper, it looked like charity. In practice, it had become something far more sinister. The townspeople gathered around the auction block represented the full spectrum of frontier morality. Some genuinely believed they were witnessing a necessary evil, a way to prevent starvation and abandonment. Others saw opportunity in human suffering, calculating profit margins and labor potential. A precious few recognized the horror for what it was, but lacked the courage or power to speak against it. Among these was Mary Clearwater, a 75-year-old woman whose own memories of being bound out as a child gave her unique insight into what this family faced. As Thomas Whitehorse dismounted and approached the platform with measured steps, every person present understood that something significant was about to unfold, though none could predict whether it would be salvation or simply another form of damnation. The $50 bid hung in the sweltering air like a challenge to the natural order. Judge Jeremiah Stone's pale eyes narrowed as he studied the stranger who had dared interrupt his carefully orchestrated proceedings. Other potential bidders, a grizzled miner named Hutchins, who'd been eyeing Winona with uncomfortable interest, and a rancher known for working his hands to death, suddenly found the ground beneath their boots fascinating. $50 is a considerable sum, stranger, Stone said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as law. You certain you understand what you're purchasing? The woman is completely blind, and the girl's got Indian blood. They come with considerable debts and complications. Thomas stepped forward, his spurs creating a soft rhythm against the packed earth. Up close, Ayanna could hear something in his breathing that spoke of controlled emotion, of a man holding himself together through sheer will. I understand the terms, Your Honor. Got the money right here. He produced a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of silver coins, his entire life savings, though no one in the crowd could know that this represented every cent he'd managed to keep from his years as a USD Marshal. The transaction itself took on the surreal quality of a nightmare wrapped in legal formalities. Stone produced documents that had clearly been prepared in advance, contracts that bound the purchased parties to their new guardian, with language that would have made a plantation owner proud. Thomas signed with steady hands, but Ayanna's enhanced hearing caught the slight tremor in his voice as he spoke the required words. The papers transferred not just responsibility but ownership, legal guardianship that stripped away the last vestiges of their independence. As the small crowd began to disperse, several townspeople approached with comments that revealed the complex web of opinion surrounding the auction. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pressed a small bundle of food into Winona's hands with tears in her eyes. "This ain't right," she whispered, loud enough for others to hear. "Ain't Christian." But her husband quickly pulled her away before she could say more. Old Pete Morrison, no relation to Thomas despite the shared surname, spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "Waste of good money if you ask me. Blind squaw and a half-breed girl. Should have let the territory handle 'em." His words carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd never questioned the moral landscape he inhabited. Mary Clearwater moved with surprising agility for her age, intercepting Thomas as he prepared to help his new charges into his wagon. Her weathered face carried the weight of 7 decades, including memories that most preferred to forget. "You listen to me, young man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute authority. "I was sold at auction myself back in '23. Was just 8 years old when they put me on a block in Kansas. Called it binding out orphans. Took me 15 years to buy my freedom." Thomas's hand stilled on the wagon's side. This was information that changed everything. Confirmation that the system Stone had created wasn't innovation, but repetition, the same machinery of human commerce that had always existed, just dressed in new legal language. "Some folks who got bought at these auctions," Mary continued, her eyes fixed on Stone's retreating figure, "they don't make it to their next birthday. Accidents happen, you understand. Falls down mine shafts, kicked by horses, all sorts of unfortunate incidents." Her meaning was clear. This wasn't just about debt servitude, but about permanent disappearance. The wagon ride out of town passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clip of hooves on hard-packed earth. Thomas had positioned himself to give mother and daughter as much privacy as possible, but the confines of the wagon seat made complete separation impossible. Winona sat between the two adults, her young mind processing the magnitude of what had just occurred while maintaining the protective vigilance that had become second nature. Ayana's partial blindness actually sharpened her other senses to an almost supernatural degree. She could smell the honest sweat of hard work on Thomas, mixed with leather and horse and something else, a metallic scent that spoke of weapons kept clean and ready. His breathing patterns told her he was nervous, but not predatory, concerned but not calculating. Most importantly, she detected none of the sour excitement that had emanated from the other bidders. "You got a name?" Thomas finally asked as they left Red Mesa's dusty streets behind. "Ayana Crowfeather," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "This is my daughter Winona." "Thomas Whitehorse," he offered in return, "though most folks just call me Hawk." The exchange of names carried more weight than simple courtesy. In the world they inhabited, names were currency, reputation was armor, and the decision to reveal truth was always calculated. Thomas's choice to offer his true name rather than one of the dozen aliases he'd used during his years as a lawman represented a commitment he wasn't entirely sure he was prepared to honor. As they traveled the rough road toward Thomas's ranch, each lost in their own thoughts, none of them could anticipate how completely their lives were about to change. Ayana wondered if she had simply traded one form of captivity for another. Winona calculated escape routes, while simultaneously hoping she wouldn't need them. Thomas questioned every decision that had led him to this moment, while knowing he would make the same choice again. The sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that Ayana could sense but not fully see. Somewhere behind them, Judge Stone was already planning his next auction, confident that his system would continue to function with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. And somewhere ahead lay a small ranch that would either become a sanctuary or another kind of prison. The difference would depend on choices none of them had yet been called upon to make. Thomas's ranch materialized from the evening landscape like a promise half-kept, modest but solid, with a small cabin, weathered barn, and corrals that spoke of a man who took care of what he owned. The property nestled in a valley where cottonwoods marked the path of a seasonal creek, their leaves whispering secrets in the cooling breeze. As they approached, Ayana's heightened senses catalogued details that told her more than sight ever could. The smell of well-maintained leather, the sound of healthy horses moving in their paddock, the absence of decay that marked abandoned places. "It's not much," Thomas said, as he helped them down from the wagon, his calloused hands gentle but impersonal. "But it's clean, and the roof don't leak. You'll have the cabin. I'll take the barn loft." Winona's sharp eyes swept the property with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned that survival depended on understanding every possible advantage and threat. She noted the rifle mounted above the door, the way the windows commanded views of all approaches, the strategic positioning that spoke of military thinking. Her mother might be partially blind, but Winona saw everything, including the way Thomas's shoulders carried a tension that suggested this generosity came with a price he hadn't yet revealed. The first week established routines that felt fragile as morning frost. Thomas rose before dawn to tend his horses and cattle, returning for breakfast that Ayana prepared with ingredients from his surprisingly well-stocked larder. Her cooking transformed simple bacon and beans into meals that carried the warmth of genuine care, though she moved through the cabin with the careful navigation of someone still learning its geography. Winona helped where she could, but spent most of her time observing, reading, and slowly mapping the emotional terrain of their new situation. It was during these quiet, domestic moments that small mysteries began to accumulate. Thomas knew too much about legal procedures for a simple cowboy. When Ayana asked about their status, he explained territorial law with the precision of someone who had lived inside its complexities. His books, which Winona discovered in a wooden crate, included legal texts and federal statutes alongside the expected adventure novels and agricultural guides, Most telling was his reaction to loud noises. A plate dropped in the kitchen sent him reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, his body moving with trained reflexes that suggested a very different kind of past. The first crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Judge Stone arrived unannounced, accompanied by Deputy Marshal Crawford and a man neither Thomas nor the women recognized. Stone's pale eyes surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone conducting an inspection, though he maintained the pretense of a social call. "Just checking on our investment, Whitehorse," Stone announced, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. "The territory has an interest in ensuring that dependents are properly cared for. Can't have folks thinking we auction people off to just anyone." The comment carried multiple layers of threat. Stone's emphasis on investment made clear that he viewed Ayanna and Winona as commodities rather than human beings. His reference to territorial interests suggested that Thomas's guardianship could be revoked at any time. Most ominously, his casual mention of other auctions implied this was an established system with rules Thomas was only beginning to understand. "They're being cared for properly," Thomas replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Ayanna's helping with the cooking and household management. Winona's been reading to us in the evenings. They're earning their keep." Stone's smile held no warmth. "Reading? That's interesting. Most blind Indian women I've known couldn't even speak proper English, let alone appreciate literature." He stepped closer to Ayanna, who stood perfectly still despite her obvious discomfort. "Tell me, woman, what exactly has Mr. Whitehorse here been having you read?" The question was a trap, though its exact nature remained unclear. Ayanna's partial sight allowed her to make out Stone's general position and movements, but she maintained the fiction of complete blindness that had become essential to their survival. "Winona does the reading, sir. Bible verses mostly, and sometimes stories from the newspaper when Mr. Whitehorse brings one back from town." "How appropriate," Stone said, though his tone suggested he found nothing appropriate about it at all. "And you, girl?" He turned to Winona with the sudden attention of a hawk spotting prey. "What do you make of your new situation? Are you being treated well?" Winona had been dreading this moment since their arrival. At 13, she possessed an adult's understanding of the precarious nature of their position, but Stone's question demanded an answer that could doom them all if misjudged. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Mr. Whitehorse has been very kind to us." "Kind," Stone repeated, as if tasting the word for hidden meanings. "Kindness is a luxury, child. What matters is usefulness. Can you perform household duties? Tend livestock? Contribute something beyond mere consumption of resources?" "She helps with everything," Thomas interjected, his protective instincts finally overriding his caution. "Both of them do. They're not burdens. They're family." The word family hung in the air like a challenge to everything Stone's system represented. His pale eyes fixed on Thomas with renewed interest, cataloging details that might prove useful later. "Family," he repeated slowly. "How remarkably progressive of you, Whitehorse. Though I wonder what your neighbors might think of such modern arrangements." The threat was clear. Stone could weaponize community prejudice against them whenever it suited his purposes. Thomas felt the weight of his hidden past pressing against his chest. If Stone discovered he was a former federal marshal, the entire legal framework that had allowed this rescue would collapse. After Stone and his companions departed, the cabin felt smaller, more vulnerable. Thomas paced the floor like a caged animal, while Ayanna sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap with deceptive calm. Winona curled in the corner with a book, though her eyes tracked Thomas's movements rather than the words on the page. "He'll be back," Thomas finally said, "and next time he'll be looking for reasons to terminate the arrangement." "What kind of reasons?" Ayanna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Any kind he wants to manufacture, neglect, abuse, failure to properly care for dependents, he's got the legal authority to decide what constitutes adequate guardianship. Thomas stopped pacing and faced her directly. There's something you both need to understand. This isn't just about debt or charity or even prejudice. Stone's building something here, a system that lets him control people's lives with legal authority. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. The revelation settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just individuals trying to survive. They were part of something larger and more sinister, a machine designed to process human lives into profitable arrangements. The question was whether they could find a way to break free without destroying themselves in the process. That night, as Thomas settled into his bedroll in the barn loft, he stared at the stars visible through gaps in the roof and wondered what he had gotten them all into. $50 had bought their freedom from the auction block, but it might have simply traded one form of captivity for another. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical thing, made heavier by the growing certainty that Judge Stone was far more dangerous than he appeared. The autumn weeks that followed Stone's visit brought an unexpected transformation to the small ranch. What had begun as a desperate arrangement gradually evolved into something resembling genuine family life, though each participant remained acutely aware of the artificial nature of their situation. Thomas found himself looking forward to evening meals where Ayanna's quiet wisdom and Winona's sharp observations created conversations that filled corners of loneliness he hadn't realized existed. The women, for their part, discovered that Thomas's protective presence allowed them to breathe freely for the first time since Robert's death. Ayanna's contributions to the household extended far beyond cooking and cleaning. Her years as a teacher had given her skills that proved invaluable in their isolated existence. She could calculate supplies, organize resources, and solve practical problems with an efficiency that impressed Thomas daily. More importantly, she began teaching both him and Winona to see the world through different perspectives, literally in her case as she demonstrated how sound, smell, and touch could provide information that eyes might miss. "You're looking, but not seeing," she would tell them when they struggled to locate a lost tool or identify an approaching rider by the sound of hoofbeats alone. Winona blossomed under the stability their arrangement provided. Her fierce intelligence, previously focused entirely on survival and protecting her mother, found new outlets in Thomas's small library and the complex dynamics of ranch life. She learned to read weather patterns, understand animal behavior, and navigate the subtle social codes that governed frontier existence. More tellingly, she began to relax enough to act her age occasionally, laughing at Thomas's clumsy attempts to braid her hair or racing him to complete evening chores. Thomas discovered that his years of solitary existence had left him unprepared for the simple intimacies of shared domestic life. The sound of Ayanna humming while she worked, Winona's delighted exclamations over a well-executed rope trick, the comfortable silence that settled over them during evening reading sessions, these small pleasures carried a weight that surprised him. He found himself making excuses to return to the cabin during the day, ostensibly to check on supplies or repair equipment, but really just to be near the life they were building together. It was during one of these domestic interludes that Thomas made a discovery that changed everything. While helping Winona organize his books, he noticed her reading a complex legal text with the same fluency she brought to simple adventure stories. When he commented on her advanced reading ability, she responded with casual references to constitutional law and territorial statutes that no 13-year-old should have possessed. "Mother taught me," Winona explained when pressed. "She said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't take away from us, so I needed to learn everything I could." This led to the revelation that Ayanna had been largely self-educated in legal matters, studying law books borrowed from sympathetic attorneys and judges back when such resources had been available to her. Her blindness had never prevented her from understanding the systems that now controlled their lives. This discovery prompted Thomas to share more of his own background than he had intended. Without revealing his former profession directly, he began discussing legal strategies and territorial politics with a sophistication that surprised both women. Their evening conversations evolved from simple family exchanges to complex discussions of justice, law, and the moral compromises required for survival in an imperfect system. The growing intimacy between Thomas and Ayanna developed slowly, built on mutual respect rather than romantic convenience. Thomas found himself drawn to her quiet strength and sharp intelligence, while Ayanna discovered that his protective instincts came from genuine care rather than possessive control. Their first hesitant conversations about feelings and possibilities took place in the barn while Thomas tended his horses, with Ayanna's enhanced hearing allowing her to detect the nervousness in his voice that his steady hands concealed. "I never thought I'd want this again," Ayanna admitted one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch. "After Robert died, I thought that part of my life was over." The blindness just confirmed it. Who would want a woman who couldn't even see his face? Thomas's response revealed depths of emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "I see you clearer than anyone I've ever known," he said quietly. "The way you move through the world, the strength you show Winona every day, the kindness you've shown a stranger who bought you at auction, that's not something you need eyes to recognize." Their developing relationship created new complexities for Winona, who had functioned as her mother's primary companion and protector since her father's death. The 13-year-old found herself navigating unfamiliar emotional territory as she watched her mother's happiness bloom while simultaneously fearing the loss of their exclusive bond. Thomas, sensitive to these dynamics, made deliberate efforts to include Winona in his relationship with Ayanna, creating space for her to remain central to their growing family unit. The first serious test of their emotional evolution came when Thomas was forced to travel to the territorial capital on business. He couldn't fully explain. His mysterious 3-day absence left the women alone on the ranch with instructions to stay close to the cabin and avoid any contact with visitors. The isolation gave mother and daughter time to discuss their changing circumstances without Thomas's protective presence influencing their conversations. "Do you love him?" Winona asked, with the directness that adolescence sometimes allows. Ayanna's answer came slowly, carefully considered. "I think I'm learning to," she said finally. "But love built on gratitude isn't the same as love built on choice. I'm not sure which this is yet." When Thomas returned, he brought news that cast their domestic tranquility in a darker light. His business at the territorial capital had involved researching Judge Stone's legal authority and discovering the full scope of the auction system. What he learned confirmed their worst fears. Stone had processed dozens of families through his courts, and the majority had simply disappeared from official records after their initial placements. The implication was clear. Their current happiness existed at the sufferance of a man who viewed them as experimental subjects rather than human beings. This revelation forced them to confront the temporary nature of their situation and begin making plans for a future that might require dramatic action. Thomas began teaching both women to shoot, handle horses independently, and navigate by landmarks that would remain constant even if they were forced to flee quickly. Ayanna used her teaching skills to help Winona memorize important information, legal precedents, sympathetic contacts, escape routes, that could prove crucial if their family was torn apart. The emotional stakes of their situation intensified as autumn progressed toward winter. What had begun as a practical arrangement to save two lives had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. Genuine love, complicated by the artificial circumstances of its creation and the constant threat of its destruction. Thomas found himself willing to risk everything to protect what they had built, while Ayanna struggled with the knowledge that her happiness depended on a man whose own secrets might ultimately prove as dangerous as Stone's malice. As the first snow began to dust the distant peaks, their small ranch felt simultaneously like the safest place in the world and the most precarious. They had created something beautiful and fragile in the space between legal slavery and genuine freedom. But the winter ahead would test whether love built under such circumstances could survive the harsh realities of a system designed to destroy it. The crisis erupted on a bitter October morning when federal marshals surrounded the ranch before dawn, their movements coordinated with military precision that spoke of careful planning and inside information. Thomas jolted awake in the barn loft at the first sound of horses, his trained instincts immediately recognizing the deliberate spacing and professional approach of law enforcement. By the time he reached the cabin, armed men had already positioned themselves at every exit, their weapons drawn and ready. "Thomas Whitehorse, you're under arrest for violation of federal statutes regarding the transportation and concealment of territorial dependents," announced Marshal William Crawford, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him Stone's preferred enforcer. "Step away from the door with your hands visible." Inside the cabin, Ayanna and Winona huddled together as the terrible reality of their situation crystallized. The legal framework that had provided their sanctuary was collapsing with the swift brutality of a house built on sand. Ayanna's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle sounds that indicated at least 6 men had surrounded the property, while Winona's sharp eyes counted muzzle flashes through the window slats, calculating odds that offered no hope of escape. "What are the charges?" Thomas called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. His mind raced through legal possibilities, while his body remained perfectly still, aware that any sudden movement could trigger a bloodbath that would destroy everything he had tried to protect. "Kidnapping, fraud, obstruction of territorial justice, and violation of the Dependent Persons Act," Crawford replied with the satisfaction of a man reading a death warrant. "Judge Stone has provided extensive documentation of your illegal interference with lawful proceedings." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Stone had somehow discovered his true identity and was using it to destroy not just him, but the family they had built together. The irony was devastating. His years of federal service dedicated to upholding the law were now being weaponized against the most important thing he had ever tried to protect. Through the cabin's thin walls, Thomas could hear Ayanna's voice, low and urgent, as she spoke to Winona in their native language. He didn't understand the words, but their tone conveyed a desperate strategy session between mother and daughter. The sound of their quiet consultation broke his heart more than any threat the marshals could offer. "Give us 5 minutes to collect our things," Thomas called out, hoping to buy time for some impossible solution to present itself. "The women need to dress properly for travel." "You've got 2 minutes," Crawford replied, "and the women aren't going anywhere with you. They're being returned to territorial custody for proper placement." The word struck all 3 of them with the force of a death sentence. Separation meant that Thomas would face federal charges while Ayanna and Winona were returned to Stone's system, likely to be auctioned again to buyers with far less noble intentions. The careful trust they had built, the growing love that had transformed a desperate arrangement into genuine family, all of it would be destroyed by legal machinery that recognized no value beyond bureaucratic compliance. Inside the cabin, Ayanna made a decision that would haunt all of them forever. With Winona's help, she quickly gathered the few documents that proved her teaching credentials and literacy, evidence that might challenge her classification as a dependent person. But more importantly, she prepared to reveal the secret she had guarded so carefully since the mine explosion, her partial sight, which could undermine the entire legal foundation of their situation. "Winona," she whispered urgently, "when they take us, you must tell them the truth about my eyes. It's the only chance we have." "Mother, no," Winona protested, understanding immediately what this revelation would cost. "If they know you can see, they'll say you defrauded the system. Thomas could hang for conspiracy." "If we don't try something, we'll lose everything anyway," Ayanna replied, her voice carrying the desperate resolve of a mother willing to sacrifice herself for her child's future. "At least this gives us a chance to fight." Outside, Crawford's patience was evaporating with practiced efficiency. "Time's up, White Horse. Come out now, or we come in shooting." Thomas opened the cabin door slowly, his hands clearly visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Behind him, Ayanna and Winona emerged with the dignity of people who refuse to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. The sight of them, the blind woman who had taught him to see clearly, the young girl who had bridged two worlds with courage beyond her years, strengthened Thomas's resolve to fight this battle through whatever means necessary. "Marshal Crawford," Thomas said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised the federal officer, "I invoke my right as a former federal marshal to request formal review of these charges by a territorial judge other than Stone." The revelation of Thomas's true identity sent a ripple of uncertainty through the assembled lawmen. Crawford's confident demeanor wavered slightly as he processed this new information and its potential implications for the legal case they had constructed. "Former marshal or not, you're still under arrest," Crawford replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Judge Stone's authority in territorial matters supersedes any claims you might have to professional courtesy. Judge Stone's authority doesn't extend to federal officers, active or retired," Thomas countered, gambling everything on a legal technicality that might buy them precious time. "I demand immediate transport to the territorial capital for proper judicial review." The standoff that followed stretched minutes into what felt like hours. Crawford consulted with his subordinates in hushed tones, clearly uncertain about how to proceed with a case that had suddenly become far more complicated than advertised. Meanwhile, Ayanna and Winona stood together, their hands clasped tightly, preparing for whatever separation might come. It was Winona who broke the terrible silence with words that would change everything. "Marshal Crawford, my mother isn't completely blind." Judge Stone's classification of her as dependent was based on fraudulent medical testimony. The admission dropped into the tense situation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of confusion and possibility that no one could fully predict. Ayanna closed her eyes in resignation, knowing that her daughter had just sacrificed their carefully constructed protection in a desperate gamble for justice. Crawford stared at them with the expression of a man whose certainty had just been shattered by information that rewrote the entire case. If Ayanna wasn't completely blind, then Stone's legal authority over her was questionable. If Stone's medical testimony was fraudulent, then the entire auction might be deemed illegal. And if Thomas had been protecting victims of fraud rather than kidnapping dependents, then the federal charges would collapse. "Ma'am," Crawford said slowly, addressing Ayanna directly for the first time, "can you see my face right now?" Ayanna lifted her chin with quiet pride and looked directly at him, her partially functional eye allowing her to make out his features clearly enough to nod. "Yes, Marshal. I can see you. I've been able to see partially since the day Thomas bought us at auction. I maintained the pretense of complete blindness because Judge Stone made it clear that only completely helpless dependents qualified for his program." The admission hung in the cold morning air like a challenge to everything the federal marshals thought they understood about their mission. Crawford found himself facing a situation that his careful briefing hadn't prepared him for. Instead of rescuing dependents from a kidnapper, he might be destroying a family that had formed to protect victims of judicial fraud. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch that had briefly been their sanctuary, all 6 people present understood that the next few minutes would determine whether justice or expedience would prevail in their small corner of the American frontier. The revelation of Ayanna's partial sight created a legal earthquake that rippled through the assembled lawmen, but Judge Stone's response demonstrated the true depth of his corruption. Rather than retreat in the face of evidence that undermined his entire case, Stone doubled down with the ruthless calculation of a man who had built his power on the systematic destruction of inconvenient truths. "Fraud," Stone declared when Crawford's messenger reached him with news of Ayanna's admission. "Clear evidence of conspiracy to defraud territorial authorities. The woman deliberately misrepresented her condition to manipulate the auction process, and Whitehorse was obviously her accomplice." Within hours, new warrants were issued, this time charging all 3 with conspiracy, fraud, and theft of territorial resources. The nightmare that followed moved with bureaucratic efficiency. Thomas was shackled and transported to the territorial jail, his status as a former federal marshal now working against him as evidence of sophisticated criminal planning. Ayanna and Winona were separated and placed in different facilities. Ayanna in the women's section of the territorial prison, Winona in what Stone euphemistically called protective custody, but which amounted to solitary confinement in a basement room of the courthouse. The separation destroyed what remained of their emotional equilibrium. Thomas, alone in his cell, was consumed by guilt over the catastrophic failure of his protection. Every legal strategy he had developed during his years as a marshal seemed useless against Stone's systematic corruption of the judicial system. The irony was crushing. His expertise in federal law had made him confident he could protect 2 innocent people. But Stone operated in the spaces between federal and territorial authority where traditional legal protections simply didn't exist. Ayanna faced her own form of torment in the women's prison, surrounded by genuine criminals who viewed her mixed heritage and educated speech with suspicion. The guards, following Stone's explicit instructions, treated her blindness as completely fraudulent, refusing to provide even basic accommodations and subjecting her to deliberate obstacles designed to prove her deception. The psychological cruelty was calculated. Every stumble was recorded as evidence. Every successful navigation cited as proof of fraud. Winona's imprisonment was perhaps the cruelest of all. At 13, she was old enough to understand the full implications of their situation, but too young to have any legal standing to fight it. Stone's deputies questioned her relentlessly, seeking admission that her mother had coached her to lie about the blindness, that Thomas had planned the entire deception from the beginning, that their family bonds were artificial constructs designed to manipulate public sympathy. The trial, when it finally convened, was a masterpiece of judicial theater designed to legitimize Stone's predetermined conclusions. He had recruited a panel of territorial judges from surrounding districts, men who owed their positions to political networks that Stone influenced. The prosecution presented their case with the polished efficiency of a well-rehearsed performance, complete with medical testimony from doctors who had never examined Ayanna and legal precedents cherry-picked to support Stone's interpretation of territorial authority. Thomas's court-appointed attorney was competent but overmatched, a young lawyer named Samuel Harrison who genuinely believed in his client's innocence but lacked the experience to navigate Stone's carefully constructed legal maze. Harrison's opening argument was passionate but naive, focusing on the obvious injustice of the situation without recognizing that injustice was the entire point of Stone's system. "Your Honors," Harrison declared, "we ask you to consider the basic humanity of this situation. A blind woman and her daughter were placed in legal jeopardy through no fault of their own. Mr. Whitehorse acted from the highest moral principles in protecting them from exploitation. If protecting the innocent has become a crime in our territory, then we have lost our way as a civilized society." The prosecution's response revealed the sophisticated cruelty of Stone's approach. Rather than denying the family's humanity, they redefined it in terms that made their destruction inevitable. "Mr. Harrison speaks of protecting the innocent," replied Prosecutor Davidson, "but innocence doesn't excuse fraud. Mrs. Crow Feather deliberately deceived territorial authorities about her condition. Mr. Whitehorse used his federal experience to circumvent legitimate legal processes. The girl was coached to participate in their deception. This isn't about protecting family, it's about three criminals who thought they were clever enough to steal from the territory itself." The testimony phase of the trial was orchestrated to destroy any sympathy the defendants might have generated. Stone's medical witnesses testified that Ayanna's partial sight made her capable of independent living, therefore invalidating her dependent status and making the auction fraudulent from the beginning. Former neighbors testified about Ayanna's teaching career, portraying her intelligence and education as evidence that she had deliberately manipulated the system rather than fallen victim to it. Most devastatingly, Stone produced previous auction beneficiaries who testified that they had tried to help their assigned dependents, only to be deceived and stolen from by ungrateful recipients. The testimony was obviously coached, but it created a narrative in which Stone's system appeared as charitable protection for honest citizens against criminal exploitation. Thomas's attempt to testify on his own behalf backfired spectacularly when Stone's attorney revealed the full scope of his federal career. Rather than establishing his credibility, his experience as a U.S. Told Marshal was reframed as evidence of sophisticated criminal planning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor argued, "Mr. Whitehorse didn't stumble into this situation through misguided charity. He studied our territorial laws, identified their weaknesses, and executed a calculated plan to defraud our judicial system." Ayanna's testimony was the most heartbreaking moment of the entire proceedings. Stone's attorney subjected her to hours of questioning designed to demonstrate her visual capabilities while simultaneously portraying her as a master manipulator who had used her disability as a weapon against honest society. Every answer she gave was twisted into evidence of deception, every moment of confusion cited as proof of calculated performance. "Mrs. Crow Feather," the prosecutor asked with false gentleness, "when you stood on that auction block, were you thinking about the honest taxpayers whose money would be wasted on your care? Or were you already planning how to deceive whatever Good Samaritan might try to help you?" The question was legally irrelevant but emotionally devastating. Ayanna's dignity in the face of such cruelty only seemed to inflame Stone's attorney, who pressed harder for admissions that would justify their predetermined conclusions. Winona was not allowed to testify on behalf of her family, her age disqualifying her from legal standing, but Stone's team called her as a prosecution witness to establish the timeline of the alleged fraud. The sight of the 13-year-old girl being cross-examined by hostile attorneys while her mother and the man who had tried to protect them sat shackled at the defendant's table created a moment of such obvious injustice that even some of Stone's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The verdict was announced on a cold November morning that felt like the end of the world. Guilty on all charges, Thomas was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Ayanna received 10 years for fraud and conspiracy. Most cruelly, Winona was declared a ward of the territorial court, to be placed in an institution for wayward children until she reached majority. As the sentences were read, the three family members looked at each other across the courtroom with the knowledge that they might never see each other again. Thomas's hands trembled with barely contained rage at his failure to protect them. Ayanna's face showed the resignation of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed. Winona's young features carried a determination that suggested she had not accepted defeat, even if the adults had been crushed by it. The tragedy was complete, but Stone's system had functioned exactly as designed. Three people who had dared to create genuine love from artificial circumstances had been systematically destroyed as an example to others who might question the natural order of territorial authority. Justice, as Stone defined it, had been served. The reversal began not with grand legal maneuvers or dramatic courtroom revelations, but with the quiet persistence of an elderly woman who had survived her own auction 70 years earlier. Mary Clearwater had watched the trial with the patient attention of someone who understood that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes it was justice gathering strength for a more decisive blow. 3 days after the sentencing, Mary appeared at the office of Territorial Governor Marcus Wellington with a worn leather satchel containing documents that would rewrite everything the court thought it understood about Judge Stone's operation. Her weathered hands shook slightly as she spread papers across the governor's mahogany desk, but her voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. "Governor Wellington," she began, her 75-year-old voice cutting through the political pleasantries that typically dominated such meetings, "I have evidence that Judge Jeremiah Stone has been operating a human trafficking ring under the cover of territorial law for over a decade." The documents Mary presented were devastating in their meticulous detail. Shipping manifests from Stone's mining operations showed regular transfers of dependent laborers to work sites across 3 territories. Financial records revealed payments to Stone from private parties for specialty placements of auctioned individuals. Most damning of all were personal letters between Stone and associates discussing the disposal of dependents who became troublesome or unproductive. Governor Wellington, a political survivor who had built his career on reading the winds of public opinion, immediately recognized the catastrophic implications of Mary's evidence. If Stone's operation became public knowledge, it would trigger federal investigations that could destroy careers throughout the territorial government. More importantly for Wellington's calculations, it would become a national scandal that could delay Arizona's statehood ambitions for decades. "Mrs. Clearwater," Wellington said carefully, "these are serious allegations. How did you come by such detailed records?" Mary's smile held no warmth. "Judge Stone ain't the only one who knows how to plan ahead, Governor. I've been collecting evidence against that man since he started his auctions in '75. Every family that disappeared, every suspicious death, every convenient accident, I documented it all, been waiting for the right moment to use it." The revelation that Mary had been conducting her own investigation for nearly a decade transformed her from elderly witness to sophisticated operative. Her network of informants included former slaves, displaced Native Americans, and frontier women who had learned to survive by observing everything and forgetting nothing. Together, they had created a shadow documentation system that tracked Stone's crimes with prosecutorial precision. Within hours of Mary's meeting with the governor, federal marshals were dispatched to locations across the territory to investigate Mary's claims. What they discovered exceeded even her carefully documented allegations. At an abandoned mining facility 40 miles from Red Mesa, investigators found evidence of a systematic operation that had processed hundreds of individuals through Stone's auction system over the past 9 years. The facility itself was a monument to bureaucratic evil. Barrack-style buildings housed workers who had been classified as dependents and then essentially enslaved under the guise of protective custody. Medical records showed systematic abuse disguised as health care, with treatments designed to maintain dependency rather than promote recovery. Most horrifically, a cemetery behind the facility contained unmarked graves of individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances while in Stone's care. Federal investigators also discovered that Stone's operation extended far beyond simple labor exploitation. He had been selling premium dependents to private buyers across the Western Territories, marketing disabled individuals, mixed-race families, and educated minorities to buyers who paid substantial premiums for specific characteristics. The auction in Red Mesa had been merely the visible tip of a trafficking network that generated thousands of dollars in illegal revenue annually. The systematic nature of Stone's crimes became clear as investigators interviewed survivors of his system. Martha Henderson, a deaf woman who had been auctioned in 1881, testified that she had been sold to a rancher who used her as unpaid labor for 3 years before she managed to escape. James Crow Dog, a Navajo man classified as dependent due to a leg injury, described being forced to work in Stone's mines until his injury became permanently disabling, at which point he was simply abandoned to die. Most shocking of all was the testimony of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the physician who had provided medical evaluations for Stone's auctions. Under federal immunity, she revealed that Stone had pressured her to falsify medical reports, exaggerating disabilities in some cases and minimizing them in others, depending on the desired outcome for each individual. Ayanna's case was typical. Her partial sight had been classified as complete blindness to make her more suitable for Stone's trafficking network, the revelation of Dr. Martinez's cooperation explained how Stone had maintained legal cover for his operations. By controlling the medical testimony that determined dependency status, he could essentially guarantee that any individual he targeted would be classified as requiring protective custody. The system was foolproof as long as no one with sufficient authority chose to investigate the medical foundations of his legal determinations. As federal evidence mounted, Stone's carefully constructed legal edifice began collapsing with stunning speed. Governor Wellington, recognizing that his political survival depended on swift action, ordered the immediate suspension of all territorial auctions pending federal review. More importantly, he directed that all individuals currently serving sentences based on Stone's rulings be released pending new trials with untainted evidence. Thomas emerged from territorial prison on a November morning that felt like resurrection. The federal marshals who escorted him from his cell apologized for his treatment and explained that he was being released not just as an innocent man, but as someone whose actions had been heroic rather than criminal. His protection of Ayanna and Winona was now officially recognized as intervention in a federal crime rather than conspiracy against territorial authority. Ayanna's release came with medical care to address the injuries she had sustained during her imprisonment. Federal physicians confirmed that her partial sight was genuine and stable, contradicting Stone's claims that she had been malingering or deceptive about her condition. More importantly, they documented the deliberate medical neglect she had suffered in territorial custody, providing additional evidence of Stone's systematic cruelty. Winona's liberation from institutional custody was perhaps the most dramatic moment of their reunion. At 13, she had endured weeks of psychological manipulation designed to break her loyalty to her family and accept Stone's narrative about their criminal deception. Instead, she had used her time in custody to memorize every detail of the facility's operations, creating her own evidence base that would prove valuable in prosecuting Stone's associates. The family's reunion took place not in the courtroom where they had been separated, but in Governor Wellington's office, where Mary Clearwater waited with the satisfaction of someone who had played a very long game to its successful conclusion. The sight of Thomas, Ayanna, and Winona embracing freely, without shackles or guards or legal constraints, represented not just personal vindication, but systematic justice. "Mrs. Clearwater," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "how can we ever thank you?" The elderly woman's response carried the weight of 7 decades of experience with American justice. "Don't thank me yet, son. We've won the battle, but the war's just getting started. Stone's in federal custody, but the system that let him operate is still out there. Your job now is to make sure this never happens to another family." The reversal was complete, but its implications extended far beyond their personal vindication. Stone's arrest had triggered a federal investigation into territorial governance that would reshape legal protections for vulnerable populations across the American West. Their suffering had not been meaningless. It had become the foundation for systemic change that would protect countless future families from similar exploitation. The spring of 1885 arrived at the White Horse Ranch with the gentle persistence of hope fulfilled. 6 months had passed since their vindication and Stone's arrest, and the small property had been transformed from a desperate sanctuary into a genuine home. Thomas had used the federal compensation awarded to victims of Stone's trafficking ring to expand the ranch, adding a proper schoolhouse where Ayanna could resume the teaching career that had been stolen from her, along with so much else. The wedding ceremony took place on a warm May morning, surrounded by the community that had slowly come to understand the magnitude of what had been perpetrated in their name. Governor Wellington himself attended, his presence serving as both apology and political statement about the territory's commitment to justice. Mary Clearwater, now 86 but still sharp as winter wind, served as matron of honor with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see her deepest hopes realized. Ayanna wore a dress of soft blue calico that complemented her dark hair and brought out the warm brown of her eyes that could see clearly enough to watch Thomas's face as he spoke his vows. The partial blindness that had once made her vulnerable now served as a metaphor for a different kind of sight, the ability to perceive truth that others missed. She had learned to see love in the sound of Thomas's voice, wisdom in Winona's questions, and hope in the community's gradual acceptance of their unconventional family. "I promise to be your eyes when the world grows dark," Thomas said during the ceremony, his voice carrying across the gathering with the weight of lived experience, "and to trust your sight when mine fails to see what matters most." The words were simple, but everyone present understood they carried meanings forged in suffering and tested by injustice. Winona, now 14 and poised on the edge of young womanhood, served as both witness and bridge between the worlds that had shaped their family. Her experience in Stone's custody had matured her beyond her years, but the stability of the past months had allowed some of her childhood wonder to return. She had thrown herself into her studies with renewed passion, determined to become the lawyer her family's experience had shown they desperately needed. The community celebration that followed the ceremony revealed how completely their vindication had transformed local attitudes. Families who had once whispered about the Indian woman and her half-breed daughter now spoke with pride about the teachers who had exposed corruption and helped bring federal justice to their territory. Children who had been taught to fear difference now competed for seats in Ayanna's classroom, where her unique teaching methods had proven remarkably effective. Thomas had officially returned to federal law enforcement, but in a new capacity that reflected the lessons of their experience. Governor Wellington had recommended him for appointment as Territorial Marshal for Native American Affairs, a newly created position designed to prevent the systematic abuse they had endured. His first cases involved investigating similar auction systems in other territories, armed now with Mary Clearwater's documentation methods and Ayanna's insights into the legal vulnerabilities of marginalized communities. The schoolhouse Ayanna had established became a model for territorial education, demonstrating that disabled students could excel when provided with appropriate accommodations and respect. Her teaching methods, developed through her own experience with partial blindness, proved valuable for all students, not just those with obvious disabilities. Federal education officials began visiting the ranch school to document her techniques for implementation across the territory. Winona's role in their family had evolved from protector to ambassador, translating between the adult world of legal complexities and the simpler needs of childhood. She had begun corresponding with other young people whose families had been affected by Stone's system, creating an informal network of survivors who supported each other's recovery. Her letters revealed a maturity and wisdom that impressed adults while maintaining the optimism that made her an effective advocate for change. The financial settlement from the federal government had provided them with security they had never imagined possible. But more importantly, it had validated their suffering and acknowledged the government's responsibility for the system that had nearly destroyed them. Thomas used his portion to establish a legal defense fund for families facing similar circumstances, while Ayanna invested hers in educational materials and equipment for students with disabilities throughout the territory. Mary Clearwater's role in their vindication had made her something of a territorial celebrity, but she used her newfound influence to continue the work that had defined her life. Her documentation system became the foundation for a federal tracking program designed to prevent future trafficking operations. At 86, she had finally achieved the justice that had eluded her for 7 decades. But more importantly, she had created systems that would protect future generations from similar exploitation. The legal precedents established by their case rippled across the American West, leading to federal legislation that prohibited the auction of human beings under any circumstances. The White Horse Protections, as they came to be known, established clear federal authority over cases involving disabled individuals, mixed-race families, and other vulnerable populations. Stone's conviction and life sentence served as a warning to other officials who might consider similar schemes. Their personal happiness was built on foundations stronger than romantic love or family bonds. It was grounded in shared purpose and mutual respect earned through the worst circumstances imaginable. Thomas had learned that protection meant more than physical safety. It required understanding and accepting the full humanity of those he sought to help. Ayanna had discovered that her disability, far from making her dependent, had given her unique insights that could help others navigate an unfair world. Winona had found that her mixed heritage, once a source of isolation, made her uniquely qualified to bridge different communities and advocate for understanding. The evening of their wedding day found the three of them sitting on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose. Ayanna could see the colors well enough to appreciate their beauty, while Thomas and Winona described details her partial sight might have missed. It had become their family tradition, sharing different perspectives to create a more complete picture of the world around them. "Do you think we would have found each other if Stone had never existed?" Winona asked with the philosophical curiosity that marked her approaching adulthood. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think love finds a way," he said finally. "Maybe not the same way, maybe not as quickly, but people who are meant to be together usually are one way or another." Ayanna's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through suffering and recovery. "Stone thought he was controlling our lives, deciding our fates based on what he saw as our weaknesses. But our love grew from those very weaknesses. My blindness taught you both to see differently. Winona's youth gave us hope for the future. Thomas's guilt drove him to be the protector we needed. Stone tried to use our vulnerabilities to destroy us, but they became the foundation of our strength instead." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, their small ranch felt like the center of a universe that had finally aligned itself around justice and love. The battles they had fought had made them stronger individually and as a family, while their victory had created protections for countless others who would face similar challenges in the future. They had transformed personal suffering into systemic change, private love into public good. The happiness they had earned was not the simple contentment of a fairy tale ending, but the complex satisfaction of people who had faced the worst aspects of human nature and chosen to respond with their best. Their family, born from desperation and tested by injustice, had become a symbol of what was possible when love refused to be limited by artificial boundaries or social conventions. In the morning, they would wake to new challenges and continuing work, but tonight they were simply a family sitting together under an infinite sky, grateful for the journey that had brought them home to each other. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't born from fairy tale meetings, but from the darkest moments when hope seems lost forever. Like Thomas, Ayanna, and Winona, many of us have faced times when society tried to define our worth by our limitations, our age, our health challenges, our family circumstances. We've stood on our own auction blocks, wondering if anyone would see past what the world calls our disabilities to recognize the wisdom, strength, and love we still have to offer. This story reminds us that it's never too late to find family, whether through blood or choice. At 55, 65, or beyond, we can still be someone's protector, teacher, or beacon of hope. Our scars don't make us less valuable. They make us more compassionate. Our struggles don't diminish our capacity for joy. They deepen our appreciation for genuine connection. Mary Clearwater waited 70 years for justice, but she never stopped fighting. Thomas found purpose after believing his best years were behind him. Ayanna discovered that losing her sight helped her see what truly mattered. Their auction block became the foundation of unshakable love. What auction block in your life became the beginning of something beautiful? Have you ever found that your greatest challenge led to your most meaningful relationship? Share your story. Someone needs to hear that hope survives even the darkest moments.